Hello YouTube, welcome back to Nutkin Farm. I finally found this Macadamia 835 tree that I mentioned a few videos ago that had put on a few nuts well and truly before its time. And here they are, 3 nuts on this 835 planted a bit under 3 years ago, and it's an exception because none of the others actually have any crop on, but very well done and good to see. As far as the rest of the harvest is concerned, the news from me is that I've decided to rule a line under the 2023 season and simply not do any formal harvesting for this year. I did some maths and working it all out. The cost of harvesting these nuts was relatively just too high compared to the return I was going to get for them. And that's the cost of getting in a skip, the diesel, the mechanical costs of harvesting the nuts and having them processed and sorted very heavily in order to get the reject level down to acceptable levels. And I have heard some horror anecdotes about a certain processor contacting growers after receiving shipment of a nut and saying, look, mate, your nuts aren't worth processing. What do you want to do? Because you're going to end up owing us. And I hope those stories aren't true, but I feel very sorry for the farmers who've done their best and actually spent the money getting that crop in. Driving around the Northern Rivers, it's a bit interesting. There's plenty of farms, particularly in the Alstonville Plateau, where they've gone ahead with the harvest because everything's nice and groomed under the trees like you see here. And you wouldn't really do that unless you intended to pick up the nuts. But there are plenty of other farms and more in the Eureka Plateau than the Alstonville Plateau where there's been no mowing at all, and these are early dropping varieties, so it's not like they've harvested and then gone away. There just is no harvest, and that's on some farms that are substantially bigger than mine. So other people have come up with the same attitude that they're just not going to harvest this year and lose money delivering nuts to nut processors who are, at least on some level, still making money by, having a price for macadamia nuts that is too low for the farmer to bear. So maybe next year. But the subject of this video is a little bit more optimistic than that, and that is, what does a macadamia farmer do in winter? And it's a good question because really it is a less busy time of year. For the most part, the crop has dropped and you've got an opportunity to actually walk around and plan your orchard for the next season. Now, the trees at this point are all in all stages of development, but one thing that you will see on most trees in June is signs of the flower forming for the next season. And you can see on this branch, for example, these branches, there are tiny little green tips showing the budding flower, which is going to turn into long flower racemes and hopefully turn some of that into nuts for the next spring. And it varies tree to tree. Some are better than others. Some trees are still busy cropping, like that one, and you're not seeing too much evidence of flowering there. But in a mixed block like this, where I've got a lot of different varieties, I see flowers in different stages of development. There's some nice little buds there, and there behind my hand is the beginning of a raceme that will turn into a nice low-hanging flower bunch for hopefully forming some new macadamias. Now, planning for that is actually something that you should have done early in autumn, because it's early in autumn where these trees make that decision. They start forming the flower buds for next season. And you don't see them until now, but the energy has to already be in the tree for those things to form. So it's not like you can see these flower buds forming and going, oh, look, that looks like a great crop, quickly feed the trees. You're meant to have the food in the trees well and truly before then. And secondly, if you do feed the trees now in the drier part of the year, at least in the northern rivers, your fertiliser isn't likely to reach the roots for some time. We'll get the odd rain shower, there's no problem with that. But in terms of getting bulk fertiliser down to the root zone, you're already too late. And that's the thing about planting macadamias. You've really got to do it almost a year in advance, because what you do now has an effect almost 6 months on. Now, the same thing applies to if you see a tree flowering like crazy in spring and you start rubbing your hands in glee and going, wow, we're going to have a great crop this year. Time to feed the trees. Well, it's a little bit late. I mean, it's still worth doing, but it's definitely a little bit late in terms of these buds on the trees are going to potentially form into little nuts, and then the tree's going to make a decision in October or so whether to keep those nuts or whether there's not enough energy to bother about, and it just drops them on the ground as little shedded pinhead-sized nuts. So that food that you might want to put into the tree has to be there and into the actual tree itself, not just on the soil, by October. So if you're planning for a big crop, you do feed in autumn, and certainly when macadamia prices were high, the wisdom was you might feed in February and May. There's no one really suggesting that you feed in winter itself, although it's not too late to put some food down and hope for some rain. I'm feeding my baby trees because I'm not looking for a crop from them. I'm actually looking for growth, and I'm going to feed some slow release pelletized manure, organic life on this occasion. And if it rains, great. If it doesn't rain, look, also fine. That's the sort of fertiliser that can hang around until it's ready. But for the rest of it, well, really, if you've got buds like this, the trees have got enough food to at least flower, and you can look at what happens after that. And I suppose the topical question, which is, keeps coming back to the price of macadamias, what if you don't really care about next season's crop? Would you bother feeding? The short answer is yes. The long answer is it sort of depends on what you might look at feeding. The fast release fertilisers that contain high amounts of potassium are absolutely aimed at flowering and fruiting. You can feed them in autumn, it'll go into the flower. You can feed them in spring, it'll go into the developing nut, because it's in late spring, early summer, when the tree really draws down a lot of nutrients, and potassium in particular, in putting together that macadamia oil, making the nuts grow big and viable, and also persuading the tree to hang on to them rather than drop them. So if you're feeding for a big crop, that's great, but what if you're feeding for just maintaining your asset and protecting your asset against potentially a very dry season in El Nino, or even a potentially very wet season? You can look at the balance of nutrients that you feed, and obviously you look at them together with an agronomist. But if your aim is something other than a big crop, there's some nutrients that you do need to consider. One that I'm a fan of is silica, have been for ages. There hasn't been enough research done on the effect of silica on macadamias, and I hope some more is done. But certainly in avocados, which somehow, seem to, a lot that's good for avocados seems to run good for macadamias, even though avocados are a member of the laurel family and macadamias are a protea. There's still a lot of things that happen that seem to be in common, and both of these species suffer from root rot, Phytophthora. But a trial done on avocados showed that the root mass of the avocados was 30% larger after several repeated drenchings with silicic acid, and that's cause for a silica fertilizer. It's a very good benefit if you're coming into a dry season, if trees have a better root system. And the reason for that is obviously if rain falls, the trees are better able to take up that moisture for themselves rather than lose it into the ground or to other, surrounding plants. and 2, in a dry season anyway, you want the strongest possible root system so that those roots can go hunting for water where it's very scarce on the ground. And that's something that doesn't, takes the focus away from flower and fruit and really goes into sort of the health of the tree. You'd want to keep the trace elements up. Boron's good, certainly for getting nutrients around the tree. Boron is a nutrient that actually helps transport nutrients, and calcium as well. You wouldn't want to skimp on calcium sources of fertilizer. I've done a very big liming in my old blocks where the pH was poor, but calcium as a nutrient is quite good for the strength of a tree generally, and something that you might want to focus on if your focus is the trees more than the crop. But above all, when you look at the crop that might happen, which you're seeing in June, and the crop that does happen, just walking around your orchard and observing is, outside of an agronomist, one of the best things you can do to plan for the year ahead. What if you're looking at trees and hoping to see these baby flowers everywhere and you're not seeing them at all? It does sort of suggest that you need to change your feeding program, because really it's mostly a product of feeding. Could also be a product of the amount of water that the tree's getting. There's nothing you can really do for the upcoming season because you might promote some out of season flowering, but in season flowering at this point isn't likely to be prompted. But again, think long term, use winter to do the planning, because when things get very active in the spring and the summer, sometimes planning just sort of falls to the side and you're just rolling with the punches of what you planned earlier. I'll leave you with this nice peaceful scene and the sounds of birds, and I hope whatever you're doing, you're having a good time. Catch you very soon. Bye for now.